Welcome back. Today we are going to take a little look at something that was revealed at the LVO 2025 Warhammer Preview live stream. Grief, how did I say all of that correctly? Did I say it correctly? I'm sure it's fine. Something that surprised me. Kind of. It had already been leaked, but the final product, the final thing that we got to see, not even on the stream, just thrown in an article on the website, was a new Death Guard model. And I have to say that it is by far my favourite Death Guard model that they've done for quite some time. See, I do quite like the Death Guard, but I tend to find that a lot of the stuff is just a little too busy for my personal taste, when it comes to Space Marines, at least. A lot of their stuff is extremely crowded. There's a lot going on. I find some silhouettes a little bit difficult to read, and even when it comes to things like characters, there's a lot happening with them. For instance, Scribus Wretch the Tallyman, it's a fun model. I do like it, but good lord, there is so much texture going on for what is effectively a dude in power armour. We've got a bunch of runes, we have little pockmarks, there's a load of paper, there's a big, what is it called, abacus? I think that's it, isn't it? There's a lot going on. It's quite busy, it's quite heavy on those tiny details. It's a little bit much for me. Same thing with, like, the Biologist Putrefier. Again, I really like this model, this is a very fun model, but it's definitely not quiet, you know? There's a ton going on. Even the big name characters are not free from an abundance of extra stuff. When we look at Typhus, Herald of the Plague God, we've got quite a lot happening. It's a recurring theme, and it also spreads to a lot of the just normal infantry units when it comes to this faction. That's why I found this particular model super interesting. So this was the new Lord of Poxes, and I absolutely love this. I think this is one of the best Death Guard models that they've shown off for a long, long time. And I think a large part of that is because, comparatively, it's relatively simple. Now, obviously, I'm saying that whilst we have a significant number of different textures present, but we have different textures present, just not in an overabundant fashion. We've got some cloth over the shoulder, there's a bit of cloth at the front, and then we have whatever that big contraption on the top of the armour is. But overall, you'll note that the armour is pretty lacking in runes, in excessive damage, in loads of pustules or pockmarks or fungus growths or coral reefs or spikes or bits of intestine, you name it. You know, there's a lot going on a lot of the models with the Death Guard range where they are very gross, appropriately so, but a lot of it is extremely heavy-handed in some ways. Whereas this isn't really that heavy-handed at all. I mean, comparatively, it has got a weird silhouette, we know this. You can't clearly read this in silhouette form, is what I'm getting at, but when you actually see it, comparatively, if we take a look at old Scribus Wretch here again, there is so much going on that model compared to the new Lord of Poxes. But the thing is, this still looks very, very Death Guard. Yes, we have got a little bit of weird organic pipe going straight into the chest there. Yeah, we've got a bit of rotten cloth. Always nice to see a bit of rotten cloth, only in this context though, obviously. But despite the fact that it's not absolutely coated in weird plant growths or fungal spores or, you know, it doesn't have 1,000 flies crawling all over it, it's still very, very clear and very recognisable as to what faction this model belongs to. Even if it was bare grey plastic, you've still got all the hallmarks, but in a much reduced fashion to what we're used to seeing elsewhere. And again, if we take a look at the Biologist Purifier, we do have in some sections of this model fairly plain metal, but it's also heavily interfered with these huge pockmarks and craters. This, by contrast, is kind of plain. The silhouette is a puzzler. It is genuinely weird and interesting. I mean, you've got that massive contraption, you've got the huge sword, which we'll talk about in a moment, because whilst I really love the idea of it and I love the sword itself, the actual execution is odd. The plasma pistol is fine. Also, having what looks like another pistol tucked into that makeshift holster on the front of the armour, I like it, but I actually think it didn't need that. I think they could have got away with just having just a relatively plain front without having too much stuff like bolted on. Then again, it does add a little bit of flavour, so it's fine. The single rebreather look, I actually quite like. I've seen a few people say they're not fans of it, but I don't know, a bit of asymmetry, it just feels right on a Death Guard for me. This just has a very fun, very unique presence, and I feel like it's almost being allowed to breathe, ironically, where some of the other stuff isn't, just by pure dint of how much is going on. Typhus being another good example of this. You know, he does have some sections of armour that are relatively clear, but then we've also got those big like stacks coming out of the armour that's covered in smoke. There's a bunch of flies everywhere. We've got nurglings clinging onto him. We've got weird growths coming out of one of his legs. Well, both of his legs, technically. There is a lot of extra detail. There's a lot of fine detail. There's just a lot of gubbins going on. Comparatively, almost no gubbins. And yet, still fundamentally Death Guard. So if we take a look at the rear view, this is what I mean about the sword, right? He's resting his hand on the hilt of the sword, but the sword is kind of resting in this series of straps that's hanging off the big miasma generator or whatever on top of the armour, which doesn't seem like it should work. It feels like it's being counter-levered in some ways, like it should be heading towards the ground because he's actually resting his hand on it. If he was gripping it, then that might feel a little bit more natural. Also, how does he draw that sword? I don't know. Maybe he just cuts the straps each time. I don't have a clue. It's a very fun concept, and I do like the sword being sheathed, technically, I guess, but the placement of the hand is a little bit odd. But at the same time, that's a cool sword. That is a quality sword. I like that sword. Well, it's not a quality sword. It's clearly a hunk of iron that is barely capable of cutting anything. It's more a paddle than a sword at this point, but it's a really fun design. And especially the way that they've painted it, which it looks fantastic. I would actually like to see a bit more of that in the spotlight as opposed to being something on the back. But again, it has a very fun feel to it. It has a very nomadic lone warrior feel. It feels a bit anime as hell, to be honest, but I really like it. And again, it still feels recognisable. The cloth as well, by the way, the big cloak, the big cape there, fantastic. Love that. It's absolutely brilliant. And the horrible machinery that is attached to the top of the armour works really, really well too. I like the fact that it's covered by a lot of, it looks like almost like a big leather sack with like turbines plugged into it. It's just very, very cool. Oh, I think I was pretty close to describing what the big contraption on his back actually was. A miasmic turbine, a device of rusted blades and rattling engines, which readily vomits contagion into the air. Lovely. Absolutely lovely. Fantastic. Also, this detail is silly but fun. Incubated within the lungs of the wearer themselves. That's where the viruses come from. Absolutely ridiculous. What? Dude's a walking plague generator and actually does have a way of distributing said plague. This little bit's interesting as well. This fetid fog also has the added benefit of occluding the Death Guard's lumbering advance, so maybe making it a little bit trickier to target them as they're wandering very slowly across the battlefield. Anyway, I just think this is all around a very cool model, and something a little bit different to what we've seen from a lot of the Death Guard releases when it comes to single characters. There's been an overabundance of extra detail, an overabundance of very complicated looking models, and whilst this is relatively complicated, it's also plain in all the ways that make it more impactful. And I think all of that plays a big part in making this one of my favourite Death Guard characters that they've released for a while. The question is, what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. In the meantime, feel free to click all the things. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you for the next one.